There are places in America where the forest doesn't whisper, it listens. Where even the wind seems to hold its breath, afraid of what might answer if it spoke too loudly. In one of those forgotten corners, hidden deep beyond the last paved road, lies a woodland so old and silent that even maps stopped marking it decades ago. The locals call it the Hollow, though no one agrees why. Some say it's because sound doesn't echo there. Others claim it's because everything inside has been emptied of life, or worse, replaced with something else. When the first stories surfaced, hunters finding animals with no eyes, no sound, no fear, people laughed. They said it was inbreeding, nature's cruel joke on species trapped in isolation. But the laughter stopped when the photos appeared. A deer with 2 jaws. A dog with skin so thin you could see its heartbeat. A horse standing motionless for days, staring into nothing. No one knew where they came from. But someone must have made them. Because nature doesn't create things that hate being alive. It all began with an experiment meant to preserve purity, a word that, in this forest, turned into a curse. The deeper you go, the more you realize, this wasn't evolution. This was revenge. And somewhere in those woods, the last of them still move. Not quite animals. Not quite alive. Just the forgotten result of a bloodline that refused to die. The discovery began not with curiosity, but with fear. Locals had been whispering for months about strange shapes moving between the trees, shapes that did not belong to any known species. A team of wildlife researchers, driven by both skepticism and fascination, decided to document what they thought were exaggerated backwoods tales. The journey took them deep into a part of the Appalachian wilderness untouched by modern maps, a region where GPS signals faded and compasses spun uselessly. The forest greeted them not with birdsong or rustling leaves, but with an unnatural stillness that felt deliberate, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. As they ventured further, they noticed something wrong with the environment itself. The trees were twisted, their bark streaked with dark resin that smelled faintly metallic. The soil felt too soft, and the occasional animal tracks they found ended abruptly, as though the creatures had vanished mid-step. It wasn't long before the team stumbled upon their first real sign, a carcass, half buried beneath a bed of moss. What should have been a raccoon had limbs bent in impossible directions, its skull slightly elongated, and eyes entirely absent. The body had no visible wounds, yet there was an unmistakable expression of agony frozen into its features. At first, they believed it to be the result of disease or radiation, perhaps a relic of old mining contamination. But then came the sounds, faint, intermittent whimpers carried on the wind. They followed them, cautiously, through a narrow ravine where mist clung to the ground like a living thing. The cries grew louder, almost childlike, until they reached a clearing where the ground was littered with bones. Some were animal, others disturbingly unfamiliar. In the center of the clearing stood a wooden structure, half collapsed and overgrown with vines. Its door was sealed shut by rusted chains, and symbols had been carved into the wood, crude, circular patterns that seemed both human and primitive. When they broke the lock and pushed it open, the stench hit them first. Inside were dozens of jars filled with murky liquid, each containing what looked like deformed animal embryos suspended in eternal stillness. Some had multiple limbs, others had human-like features. A few seemed to have been alive not too long ago. On one of the jars was a label so faded it was barely legible, but one word could still be read clearly: *generationed*. It was in that moment the team realized this was not just a discovery of deformed wildlife. They had found evidence of something engineered, something intentionally bred, and something that should have never existed in the first place. The deeper they moved into the forest, the more it felt like stepping into a world that had forgotten how to live. There were no bird calls, no hum of insects, not even the distant scurry of rodents beneath the leaves. The air was heavy and stale, clinging to their clothes as if trying to keep them from moving forward. Every step crunched too loudly beneath their boots, and the silence that followed felt alive, reacting to each sound with a kind of watchful unease. The team exchanged nervous glances, none of them willing to admit that the absence of life was beginning to feel more frightening than the thought of any predator. The trees grew denser and darker, their branches interlocking like ribs of a massive skeleton. Even the sunlight that filtered through seemed weak and unnatural, tinted grey as though passing through smoke. Occasionally, they would catch movement in the corner of their eyes, a flicker of something pale slipping behind a trunk or vanishing into the mist, but every time they turned, there was nothing. One of the researchers, a quiet man named Dr. Halden, began marking the trees to track their path, but after an hour he realized his marks were vanishing, replaced by deep gouges that looked like claw marks. No one could explain how they appeared so quickly. By midday, they had stopped speaking altogether. Words seemed to disturb the balance of the place, as if sound itself was forbidden. The forest was so still that they began to hear their own breathing echo faintly back at them. It was not an echo that came from the direction it should have, it came from somewhere deeper, a place that wasn't visible. One of the team members suggested setting up audio equipment to capture the ambient sounds, but when they played the recordings back minutes later, there was more than silence. There was a faint heartbeat-like rhythm, slow and deliberate, as if the forest itself was alive and aware of them. When night began to fall, the silence grew heavier. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of darkness settling in, it was absolute, suffocating, like being buried under layers of thick soil. Even the wind refused to move. The branches didn't sway, and the mist hung motionless between the trees. Then, faintly, came a sound that none of them could mistake for imagination, a soft, dragging step, somewhere just beyond the tree line. Not an animal, not human, but something that moved slowly and purposefully, circling them, keeping its distance. They turned their flashlights in every direction, but all they saw were trees, endless and motionless, as the silence swallowed the sound once again. As dawn broke over the lifeless forest, the team stumbled upon something that did not belong to nature. Hidden behind a wall of ivy and collapsed branches stood a massive concrete structure, half swallowed by the earth. At first glance, it looked like an abandoned bunker, its steel doors rusted shut and its walls covered in decades of grime. The place had no markings, no signs of ownership, only a faint symbol etched into the entrance, a circle divided by uneven lines, as though drawn by an unsteady hand. The researchers exchanged looks, their earlier fear replaced by a deeper, quieter dread. This wasn't the ruin of a hunting cabin or a mining station, it was something designed to stay hidden. The air around the building felt different, colder and heavier, as though something beneath the surface was drawing the warmth away. They pried open a side entrance where the metal had corroded and slipped into a corridor that stretched deep underground. Dust and cobwebs covered every inch, and the walls were lined with shattered glass observation windows looking into rooms filled with broken equipment. Some machines were still recognizable, centrifuges, specimen tanks, oxygen regulators, but most had decayed beyond identification. The deeper they went, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a research station. It was a laboratory, one that had been buried in secrecy. Old papers and logbooks lay scattered on the floor, their edges rotted and their ink almost erased by time. But even through the fading words, the purpose of the place began to emerge. There were references to Project Luma, generation continuity trials, and cross-strain purity data. The language was clinical, detached, as if describing livestock rather than living creatures. One of the notes mentioned controlled genetic lineage cycles, a phrase that made the room fall silent. In one corner, they found an incubator still sealed shut, its glass fogged from the inside. When one of the researchers wiped it clean, what they saw made them recoil, a preserved animal fetus with two spines, one human-shaped, pressed against the glass as if trying to escape. The realization settled over them like a weight. This facility wasn't studying nature, it was rewriting it. The same creatures they had been hearing in the woods might have been created right there, abandoned when the project collapsed. On a cracked wall, someone had scrawled words in what looked like dried paint, but closer inspection revealed it was something darker. It read, "We couldn't stop the birth." The team knew then that what they had uncovered was not merely evidence of failed science, but the remnants of an experiment that had defied the laws of both ethics and evolution, and the consequences were still alive somewhere in the forest. Inside one of the upper rooms of the facility, a thick layer of dust blanketed everything like snowfall frozen in time. Broken desks, overturned chairs, and a shattered filing cabinet filled the space. The faint beam of a flashlight cut through the gloom, glinting off something that caught their attention, a stack of black and white photographs scattered across the floor. They weren't stored neatly or filed away, it was as if someone had tried to destroy them and failed. The researchers knelt to examine the images, brushing away dust and flakes of mold that had grown into their edges. What they saw silenced the room completely. Each photograph showed an animal, but not any kind they recognized. The forms were familiar yet horribly altered, as though nature had been coerced into reshaping itself under human command. One image showed a dog-like creature with two sets of jaws overlapping in a grotesque smile. Another revealed a deer whose legs bent backward, standing awkwardly upright like it was trying to mimic human posture. A third photograph displayed something small, a rabbit perhaps, but its skin was translucent, its organs visible beneath the surface like a living anatomy chart. Each picture was labeled not with names or species, but with cold, impersonal numbers *specimen 014 *, trial 3b *, subject 22. There were hundreds of them. Some photos bore red ink markings, circles around deformities or handwritten notes that said progressing, mutation stable, or simply terminated. The deeper they sifted through the pile, the more disturbing the images became. In a series of later photographs, the lighting and background shifted, no longer clinical, but taken in the forest itself. The same creatures appeared outdoors, wandering among trees and streams, as if released or escaped. Their bodies looked worse, more decayed and fragmented, but their eyes had changed. They were not blank or animal-like anymore, there was a flicker of recognition in them, a haunting awareness. One of the researchers dropped a photograph when they realized the tree in the background matched one they had passed earlier that day. It meant at least some of these things still existed, moving somewhere in the same forest where they stood. On the last page of a folder half buried under debris, a faded note was attached to a photograph of a creature too mutilated to identify. The note read, "Field viability achieved. No further containment possible." The handwriting was rushed, uneven, and smeared as if written in panic. The team felt a quiet horror take root among them. Whatever happened in that facility hadn't ended decades ago. It had simply moved beyond the walls, into the trees, where it continued to survive on its own terms. Among the scattered debris, one of the researchers found a sealed metal drawer hidden behind a collapsed table. It was locked, but corrosion had weakened the latch, allowing them to pry it open with a crowbar. Inside lay several hard drives wrapped in plastic, miraculously preserved despite years of decay. They carried them back to their base camp, rigged up a generator, and connected the drives to an old laptop they had brought for documentation. At first, the screens displayed nothing but corrupted files and static, but after several hours of patient decoding, folders began to appear, dozens of them, labeled with strings of dates and project codes. When the first video file opened, the room went completely silent. The footage was grainy, filmed in a sterile laboratory with harsh white lighting. Scientists in hazmat suits moved about calmly, documenting animals caged in glass enclosures. The creatures inside looked ordinary at first: wolves, rabbits, deer, but as the videos continued, it became clear these were not natural specimens. Some of the animals trembled constantly, others had strange physical traits that grew worse with each generation recorded. One folder contained labeled experiments titled Lineage Control Phase, where researchers intentionally paired offspring from the same genetic lines to observe resilience under degenerative pressure. The notes accompanying the footage detailed deformities, organ failures, and mental instability, all described clinically, as if suffering were just another metric of success. One of the most disturbing clips showed a young deer standing unsteadily, its legs fused together as if the bones had refused to separate during development. A voice off-screen said, "Subject retains partial mobility, viability acceptable for continuation." Another clip showed two dogs, both blind from birth, sniffing at each other through a glass barrier while researchers discussed behavioral recognition across mirrored kinship. The words were clinical, detached, but the images conveyed something far more sinister. These creatures were being bred not for survival, but to test how long a species could endure its own corruption. Among the data logs was a name, Continuity Project, followed by a line that froze them in place, Phase 4 approved for release testing in open habitat. The forest surrounding the facility had been used as the testing ground. These deformed creatures were not accidents of isolation, they were the product of deliberate human design. The files ended abruptly after that entry, with the last video showing the same cages empty, their glass panels shattered, and alarm lights flickering in the background. No explanation followed, only a final entry timestamped at 3:17 a.m., reading, "Containment breach confirmed. All subjects untraceable." The team realized that the forest they had walked into was not just a forgotten part of nature, it was the aftermath of an experiment that had escaped human control. When the team descended from the forest to the nearest town in search of answers, they found a place that looked as forgotten as the woods themselves. The main street was little more than a strip of cracked asphalt lined with shuttered stores and faded signs. A handful of people lingered outside a gas station, staring as the strangers arrived, their expressions wary and unreadable. When the researchers began asking questions about the abandoned facility and the strange animals, the conversations died before they even started. People turned away, muttering short answers like "don't go there" or "that place ain't been right for years." It was clear they weren't protecting a secret, they were protecting themselves from it. The team tried the diner next, a dimly lit room that smelled faintly of old coffee and dust. The waitress refused to serve them once she heard where they had come from. She said her cousin once worked as a janitor for a government building up the ridge and that no one ever saw him again after the day the power went out for good. When they pressed for details, she simply said, "If you hear crying in those woods, don't answer it. It's not what you think." Then she walked away without looking back. The researchers left money on the table and stepped outside, the quiet of the town feeling heavier than the silence of the forest. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, an old man sitting by the church steps called them over. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp despite the tremor in his hands. He listened to their questions, nodded slowly, and then said, "They weren't animals at first." The words hung in the air like smoke. When asked what he meant, he told them that decades ago, a company had set up that facility under the guise of wildlife preservation. They paid locals to collect healthy animals, promising to breed stronger species that could survive environmental collapse. But something went wrong. The births became unnatural, and people started disappearing. Some of the missing were found later, barely recognizable, their features distorted like the creatures in the forest. Others were never found at all. The old man said the company sealed the building and left overnight, but the forest changed after that. Animals stopped behaving normally. The soil turned strange. He claimed sometimes, on moonless nights, shapes moved along the tree line that weren't animals anymore. He ended the conversation with a warning whispered more to himself than to them: "They were made from us. That's why they don't leave." The team stared at him, unable to respond, realizing that the line between man and beast had blurred long before they arrived. That night, the forest felt closer than it ever had before. The team set up camp near the base of a ridge, a narrow stretch where the trees pressed together like a wall, their black silhouettes blending into the night sky. The air was cold and unnaturally still, with only the faint hiss of the portable lantern breaking the silence. Each of them tried to write notes or record observations, but the unease that had followed them since the discovery now felt heavier, almost sentient. When the first sound came, it was faint, a low cry echoing through the trees, soft and wavering like the whimper of an injured animal. No one moved at first, assuming it was a coyote, until the sound came again, longer this time, with a tone that didn't belong to any creature they recognized. It carried a human rhythm to it, rising and falling as though something was trying to mimic a voice. They pointed flashlights toward the sound, but the beams revealed only the thick mist swirling between the trunks. One of the younger researchers, Harper, swore she saw movement, a figure crouched low, crawling on all fours, its limbs too long and thin. Before anyone could confirm, the mist thickened and the sound stopped completely. Minutes passed. Then came the crack of branches somewhere behind them, followed by a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. They turned toward it, hearts pounding, but again, nothing was visible except trees swaying in slow motion. The forest had begun to echo their movements. Every step, every whisper seemed to have a faint, delayed response, as though something was repeating them from just out of sight. They decided to keep the fire burning through the night. The flames flickered weakly, casting warped shadows against the surrounding trunks. Around midnight, the cries started again, this time from multiple directions, overlapping in a haunting rhythm. They sounded almost human, sobs, moans, the kind of noises that came from pain rather than predation. Harper wanted to check it out, believing there might be survivors or injured animals left from the old experiments. Against better judgment, she stepped into the mist with her flashlight raised. The beam disappeared after only a few feet, swallowed by the dark. The others called after her, but no voice answered. They searched until morning, finding only her flashlight lying in the dirt, its lens cracked, still faintly glowing. The forest was silent again, perfectly still, as if nothing had happened. But when they played back the night's audio recordings, the cries returned only now. Among the overlapping sounds, one faint voice whispered her name. The morning after Harper's disappearance, the forest no longer felt like a place that existed within nature. The air had a strange metallic taste, and the light filtering through the trees looked bruised, tinted in shades of gray and green that made everything appear sickly. The remaining team members, Halden, Myra, and Lewis, moved cautiously, speaking little. The weight of what had happened pressed against their minds, but none dared to suggest leaving. They had come searching for answers, and now they felt something in the woods wanted to give them one, though not in a way any of them could survive. As they retraced their steps toward the facility, they began to notice changes in the forest itself. Plants that had looked normal a day before now appeared twisted, their roots forcing through the soil like veins, and the trees seemed to lean inward, their bark covered in strange white growths that pulsed faintly when touched. It was as if the forest was absorbing what had been done to it, reshaping itself from the inside out. By midday, Myra found a clearing they hadn't seen before. The ground was littered with bones, animal at first glance, but some bearing unmistakable human shapes. A deer's skull with teeth too flat for grazing, a femur that looked wrong in proportion. The smell was faint but sour, like decaying iron. Lewis noticed movement near the edge of the clearing, a creature watching them from between the trees. Its skin hung loose around its frame, its face obscured, but its breathing was deliberate, measured, almost human. When he raised his camera, the creature retreated, vanishing soundlessly into the mist. The forest swallowed the moment as if it had never happened. That night, the wind began to move again, but it carried with it a low hum, deep and rhythmic, echoing through the trees. It wasn't mechanical, yet it seemed too organized to be natural. The sound grew louder near the facility's ruins, vibrating through the soil like the earth itself was groaning. Halden recorded the phenomenon, whispering that nature was responding to what had been done to it, that every distorted life form in these woods was not just mutation, but retaliation. The forest had taken back control of the experiment, continuing the breeding and reshaping without human intervention. The inbreeding that began in glass chambers had become part of the land itself, a biological rebellion rewriting every living thing that entered. When the humming stopped, the silence that followed felt alive again, but this time it wasn't empty. The forest had found a new balance, one born from vengeance rather than creation. Something had been awakened that would not tolerate human presence anymore. When they finally managed to restore power to one of the control rooms, the flickering monitors revealed fragments of data files and internal memos long hidden beneath decades of decay. Most were corrupted beyond recognition, but among the debris, Halden uncovered a personal journal belonging to the facility's founder, a man whose name appeared nowhere in the official documents. The first few entries spoke of ambition, of advancing selective genetics and redefining the limits of biological purity. His handwriting was sharp, confident, filled with pride. But as the entries continued, the tone shifted from scientific precision to something darker, more desperate. The man wrote of a personal tragedy, a fire that had consumed his home and taken the lives of his wife and 2 children. The incident seemed to fracture something inside him. From that point on, his experiments turned erratic, his notes less about evolution and more about restoration, resurrection, and control over what he called the disobedience of death. He began to describe the animals no longer as subjects but as vessels. He referred to them as receptacles of continuance, claiming that through controlled inbreeding, he could preserve fragments of consciousness, traits, and memory across generations. He believed he could rebuild what he lost by binding his family's genetic markers into the experimental strains. What had started as research into ecological adaptation became an obsession with creating life that would not decay, a lineage immune to loss. The files contained disturbing photographs, children's toys placed beside cages, a doll propped near a deformed fawn labeled Phase 3. It was as though the boundary between his grief and his work had dissolved completely. The more the team read, the clearer it became that the facility's purpose had never been about preserving wildlife. It was the founder's private attempt to conquer death itself. The entries near the end of the journal grew incoherent. He wrote of hearing voices in the lab, of seeing his children's faces reflected in the glass of the tanks, whispering to him that he had succeeded. His last entry, scrawled in trembling ink, read, "They remember now. The blood is awake." After that, no further records existed. The researchers realized that his final experiments had likely merged animal and human genetic lines, using his family's DNA as the foundation for what he called permanent inheritance. It explained the unnatural intelligence behind the creatures they had encountered, the way they mimicked voices and movements. These were not mere mutations, they were the living remains of a man's grief and arrogance. In his desperation to preserve what was lost, he had created something that refused to die, something that no longer belonged to either humanity or nature, and now it roamed the forest carrying his curse forward through every generation. Days after uncovering the founder's journal, the remaining researchers decided to leave the forest, their supplies nearly gone and their nerves stretched to breaking. But before they could depart, Myra insisted on retrieving the trail cameras they had placed earlier near the facility's entrance. They hoped to at least document evidence of what they had witnessed, proof that would justify their fear. When they returned to the ridge where the first camera was set, they found it smashed, its lens shattered and casing bent as though crushed by great force. The memory card was gone. 2 more cameras were missing entirely, their straps torn from the trees. The final camera, positioned near the clearing of bones, still hung in place though it was tilted downward, filming mostly the forest floor. They took it back to camp and played the footage, each frame trembling with static and distortion, but something within the noise began to take shape. The first few minutes showed nothing unusual, the trees swaying faintly, mist drifting through the undergrowth. Then, movement appeared at the edge of the frame. A figure stepped into view, pale and hunched, its body elongated like it had been stretched too far. It moved awkwardly, pulling itself forward with uneven steps, its head twitching side to side as though sniffing the air. Its face was smooth, almost featureless, save for 2 milky white eyes that reflected the faint glint of the camera's light. Behind it, shadows moved other shapes, smaller but similarly distorted, following in a slow, synchronized motion. They paused near the lens, and for a long moment, all that could be seen were the pale forms breathing, watching, their outlines rippling like they were struggling to stay solid. Then one of them turned directly toward the camera. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth that didn't look meant for eating. It leaned closer until its face filled the frame, the lens fogging with its breath. For a fraction of a second before the footage cut to black, the team swore they saw its lips move, as if it was mouthing something, a word, or a name. The final timestamp showed the recording ended at 3:17 a.m., the exact same time as the last entry in the facility's logs decades earlier. When they tried to replay the footage, the file corrupted instantly, leaving only the sound of breathing and a faint heartbeat buried beneath static. The researchers packed up and left at first light, but as they descended the trail, Myra turned back toward the forest one last time. Through the mist, she thought she saw a figure standing between the trees, still watching, perfectly motionless, its white eyes catching the dawn light. It wasn't hunting them. It was waiting.